She was 17 years old, standing inside a World Championship arena, about to attempt the same vault that had already put another girl in a wheelchair 1 year before, and the people running gymnastics knew the equipment was dangerous and said nothing. Then, 30 years later, inside a gym she had trained in since she was 10 years old, a 20-year-old nursing student slipped off the uneven bars on an ordinary Friday evening and never woke up. How many young women had to be destroyed before anyone with power decided to act? She adjusted her grips, rolled her shoulders once, and stared down the runway. The gymnasium in Stuttgart, Germany smelled like chalk dust and floor wax, and the overhead lights were so bright they made the white mats look like they were glowing. It was October 1989, and 17-year-old Adriana Duffy had just made it to the World Gymnastics Championships, one of the most important competitions in the entire sport. She had come from Puerto Rico, a small gymnastics program that most of the world had never thought about, and she had earned her place here through years of training that most people could not imagine. She stood at the start of the vault runway with her chin up and her hands loose at her sides, and she looked like exactly what she was, a young woman who had worked for this her entire life. Adriana had started gymnastics as a small child. Puerto Rico did not have the massive training centers that the Soviet Union had, no sports science labs, no Olympic development pipelines. There was just a girl with a gift and coaches who could see it, and a family who sacrificed to keep her going. By the time she was a teenager, she had fought her way onto Puerto Rico's national gymnastics team. Something most gymnasts who ever touch a bar will never achieve. She had done it on hard work alone, and she carried that fact with her everywhere she went. The vault was her event. In 1989, the vault looked very different from what gymnastics fans see today. Instead of the wide, padded vaulting table that modern athletes use, gymnasts in 1989 flew over something called the vaulting horse. It was narrow, barely 4 inches across at the top. To complete a vault safely, a gymnast had to hit that 4-inch surface with both hands at the same time, at exactly the right angle, while her body was traveling at full sprint speed. The margin for error was almost nothing. A few centimeters too far to one side and your hands would miss completely. A fraction of a second off in your timing and your body would be in a position it could not recover from. The equipment had been designed for a different era of gymnastics, when skills were simpler and speeds were lower, but the skills had gotten harder and faster, and the horse had stayed exactly the same. The gymnastics world already knew what this equipment could do. Just 12 months earlier, in 1988, an American gymnast named Julissa Gomez had slipped on the springboard at the World Sports Fair in Tokyo. Her head smashed into the side of the horse and she was paralyzed from the neck down instantly. 3 years later, she died of her injuries at just 18 years old. Coaches had talked about it. The gymnastics community had grieved and moved on, and the vaulting horse was still sitting in every gymnasium on Earth, unchanged. Nobody in charge had said that 4 inches of contact surface was not enough margin when a human body was flying through the air at sprint speed. The equipment that had destroyed Julissa Gomez's was the same equipment Adriana Duffy was about to approach. Was anyone going to protect these girls? Or was the sport going to keep feeding young women into the same machine and calling the casualties acceptable? Adriana did not know all of this the way we know it now. She knew what had happened to Julissa. Every gymnast in that building knew, but she was 17 and she was at the World Championships and she had trained for this. She stepped back, planted her feet, and began her run. Her sneakers hit the floor in quick, powerful strides. The springboard came up fast. She hit it clean, her body launching upward and forward, chalk still floating off her palms. For a brief moment she was in the air, rising toward the horse, and everything felt right. Then her hands slipped. In gymnastics they call it being lost in the air. 1 second your body knows exactly where it is and where the ground is coming from. The next second it does not. When Adriana's hands came off the horse without the correct grip, her body had no way to complete the rotation safely. She was already committed, already in the air, with nowhere to go but down. She could not pull back. She could not redirect. She came down at the wrong angle, her neck absorbing the full force of a body that had been traveling at sprint speed and had nowhere to land safely. She hit the mat neck first. The gymnasium went very quiet very fast. Medical staff reached her in seconds. She was conscious, which was something, but she could not move her legs. She lay on the mat in Stuttgart's bright gymnasium lights, while people around her spoke quickly into radios and cleared the space around her and tried to keep her still. Around her, the World Championships were still happening. Other athletes were still warming up in other corners of the building. The competition was not stopping. Adriana Duffy, 17 years old, representative of Puerto Rico, was on the floor of the most important competition of her life, and she could not feel her legs, and the sport that had put her there was already thinking about the next rotation. Before this gets darker, hit subscribe right now, because what comes next is something the sport desperately tried to move past. Don't let them. The Washington Post reported it in a small item in October of 1989. Puerto Rican gymnast Adriana Duffy had broken her neck during preparations for the World Championships and remained paralyzed in her legs. She would be transported to the United States for further treatment. That was almost the entire story as far as the mainstream sports press was concerned. One paragraph, a name, an injury, a destination, then silence. She was 17 years old and she had just lost the use of her body from the chest down, and the sport she had devoted her life to gave her one paragraph and moved on to the next competition. The doctors who received her in the United States did what they could. Spinal cord injuries work in a brutal, specific way. The cord is a column of nerve tissue that runs through the bones of the spine, and when those bones compress or fracture under sudden violent force, the cord gets damaged. The higher up the damage occurs, the more of the body loses function. Adriana's injury was high enough to leave her mostly paralyzed from the chest down. Rehabilitation could help the body adapt. Physical therapy could help maximize whatever function remained. But the spinal cord does not regrow. What was lost in that gymnasium in Stuttgart was lost permanently, in the space of 1 second, on a piece of equipment that the sports governing body already knew had a documented history of doing exactly this, because the pattern was impossible to ignore. Julissa Gomez slipped on the same vaulting horse in 1988 and was paralyzed and later died. Adriana Duffy slipped on the same vaulting horse in 1989 and was paralyzed. 9 years later, in 1998, Chinese gymnast Sang Lan fell on the vault at the Goodwill Games in New York. She was also 17. 3 gymnasts, 3 vaulting disasters. 3 teenagers destroyed by the same equipment. The International Gymnastics Federation did make adjustments after these accidents. They allowed U-shaped safety mats near the springboard, a mat, as a solution, to an equipment design problem that had already paralyzed athletes across multiple countries across multiple years. The vaulting horse was not replaced with a safer, wider table until 2001, 12 years after Adriana hit the floor in Stuttgart. 12 years during which coaches and federation officials and meet organizers watched the injuries pile up and kept setting up the same equipment and kept sending athletes over it. When the new vaulting table finally arrived in competition gymnastics, it was immediately clear how different it was. Wider, more forgiving, more contact surface for hands that might land slightly off-center. It was not a miracle solution, but it was obviously better than what had been used for decades. That improvement had been available. The knowledge of what a wider surface could do for safety had been available. The decision to wait until 2001 was not a technical limitation. It was a choice. Adriana Duffy Hurling, the name she now goes by, built a new life after Stuttgart. She earned a law degree. She became an attorney and then a professor of law at Santa Clara University in California. She has spoken in interviews about the experience of being lost in the air, about the fear of disorientation, about what it feels like to know that your body is going the wrong direction and there is nothing you can do. She has spoken about what she thinks the sport owes to athletes who trust it with their bodies. She is alive and she is formidable, and she rebuilt herself from the ground up with the same drive that put her on that runway in Stuttgart at 17. But she should not have had to. The strength she showed after her accident is remarkable. The fact that her accident happened at all, on equipment that had already demonstrated what it did to human necks, is something the sport has never fully faced. There is one more thing. When Simone Biles stepped back from events at the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, citing the twisties, that terrifying loss of spatial awareness when your mind and body disconnect mid-skill, a lot of people said she was quitting. But Adriana Duffy Hurling understood exactly what Biles was describing. She had lived the version where she could not stop. She had experienced that disorientation in Stuttgart with no choice but to keep going, already in the air. Biles stepped back because she understood what being lost in the air can cost. The critics had never had to rebuild their life because they found out the hard way. Adriana survived. She is proof of what is possible after everything is taken from you without warning. But her story is not over because the sport she loved did not learn quickly enough. And in a gym in Connecticut 3 decades later, A 20-year-old woman was about to show the world that gymnastics had still not run out of ways to break the hearts of the families who trusted it with their children. The sport moved on. The federation released statements and scheduled the next World Championships and the next Olympics and the next cycle of young girls who would spend their childhoods and throwing themselves through the air at speeds their parents could barely watch. Adriana Duffy was in hospital, learning what the rest of her life was going to look like. The gymnastics world was already looking forward. It had a habit of treating its casualties as individual tragedies rather than as evidence of a systemic failure that kept repeating itself on predictable equipment that decision makers could have redesigned years before any of these athletes hit the floor. The gym was quiet the way gyms get in the early evening, when the little kids have gone home and the serious athletes are still working. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above the equipment. The mats were worn smooth in the spots where hands and feet land 1,000 times a year. New Era Gymnastics in Hamden, Connecticut had been Melanie Coleman's second home for 10 years. She had learned her first cartwheel somewhere in this building. She had landed her first back walkover here. She had worked her way from beginner to level 10, the highest level in the USA Junior Olympics program, right here in this gym, on these mats, under these lights. On the evening of Friday, November 8, 2019, she was 20 years old, and she was doing what she had done almost every day of her life. She was training on the uneven bars. Melanie Coleman had grown up in Milford, Connecticut, about 20 minutes down the road from Hamden. Her family was the family where gymnastics was just part of who you were. Her mother had competed, her two older sisters had competed, and both of them had gone into nursing. And Melanie was doing both at once, competing for Southern Connecticut State University's gymnastics team while working toward a nursing degree that would let her take care of people the way her sisters did. She was named a Women's Collegiate Gymnastics Association Scholastic All-American. She was captain of her high school team. She was a USA Gymnastics All-America Scholar athlete. She was also, by every account from everyone who knew her, the kind of person who made the people around her better just by being there. Tom Alberti, her longtime coach at New Era, said every younger gymnast in the gym looked up to her. On the weekends, Melanie volunteered as a youth instructor at the same gym where she trained, teaching little kids how to do the same skills she had spent 10 years mastering. She was 20 years old, and she was already pouring herself into the next generation. When did gymnastics stop being a sport and start being something you survive? The uneven bars are two horizontal metal rails set at different heights. The high bar reaches about 8 feet off the ground. Gymnasts swing between them, building speed with each pass, releasing and catching and spinning in combinations that look impossible. At level 10, Melanie had been performing these skills for years. Her hands knew the shape of the bar. Her body knew the timing of each release. She was not attempting something new. This was the same exercise she had done hundreds of times in this exact building. She slipped. Nobody saw it coming, and nobody could explain it after. Coach Alberti, who was not at the gym at that precise moment, called it later a complete accident. A tragic freak accident, the GoFundMe page that the family set up would say. Totally unexpected in its occurrence and its outcome. These are the phrases people use when they are trying to make sense of something that has no explanation, when a person with a decade of experience and the highest amateur certification in her sport falls off a bar she has caught 1,000 times before. The physics of it are simple and brutal. The bar is 8 feet off the ground, and when a person falls from 8 feet and lands on her head and neck, the force involved is enough to cause catastrophic spinal damage in a fraction of a second. That is what happened to Melanie Coleman on November 8th, 2019. Her hands came off the bar at the wrong moment. Her body fell. Her head and neck took the impact. She was rushed by ambulance to Yale New Haven Hospital, less than 10 miles from the gym. Emergency teams worked on her. She was placed in critical care. Her family came. Her teammates and coaches waited for news that everyone was desperately hoping would be different from what they feared. The GoFundMe page went up almost immediately and raised more than $56,000 in 2 days 56. $1,000 from gymnasts and coaches and parents and strangers who had never met Melanie but understood exactly what her sport meant to her and exactly what was at stake. People who train in gyms and love this sport know the sound of a bad fall. They know the silence that follows it. They donated because they understood. The Coleman family had 7 members. Susan Coleman, Melanie's mother, told reporters that Melanie had followed in her footsteps and in her sister's footsteps that gymnastics and nursing and family were woven together in a way that made Melanie exactly herself. She's from a very large, loving family. Susan told the Associated Press, "We spent every day together for the past 20 years. She paused. "We're going to leave an empty space in our photos for her." On Sunday, November 10, 2019, 2 days after she slipped off the uneven bars on an ordinary Friday evening at the gym she had trained in since she was 10 years old, Melanie Coleman died. She was 20 years old. Connecticut's chief medical examiner James Gill ruled the cause of death as complications of blunt injuries of the head and neck. Her family donated her organs. Somewhere, people are alive today because Melanie Coleman's family made that decision in the worst hours of their lives. Her spirit, her laughter, and her humor would live on in the people she loved, the family wrote, and through the gift of life to people who needed it most. She had been planning to spend her career keeping people alive. She had been studying for it. She had been teaching children on weekends because she wanted to give back to the sport that had given her so much. She was 20 years old and she was still figuring out what her life was going to be, and on a Friday evening in November, it ended on a mat in a gym she had known since childhood. Did the sport that took everything from Melanie Coleman learn anything? Or is another young woman already standing at the edge of the same cliff? Head coach Mary Fredericks said her team was heartbroken and stunned. Tom Alberti said he could not process it. The school offered counseling. The tributes came from all over gymnastics, and then the questions came too. The same questions that had followed every gymnastics tragedy before this one. A study published in Pediatrics had named gymnastics the most dangerous women's collegiate sport back in 2008. Adriana Duffy had been paralyzed in 1989. The vaulting horse had finally been redesigned in 2001. And still, in 2019, a routine Friday training session at a level 10 gymnast's home gym ended with her family leaving an empty space in their photographs forever. The sport made changes after each of these tragedies. Small ones, slow ones that came years after the bodies had already fallen. Adriana Duffy rebuilt her life from a wheelchair and became a law professor. Coleman's organs kept strangers alive. Both of them gave everything to a sport that gave them so much and then, in 1 second each, took everything back. Somewhere right now, a girl is running down a vault runway. She trusts her hands. She trusts her training. She trusts the sport. The only question left is whether the sport has finally learned to deserve that trust, or whether the next name is already being written. The families of Adriana Duffy and Melanie Coleman never asked for their daughters to become symbols. They asked for their daughters to come home safe. Adriana came home changed forever. Melanie did not come home at all. Between those two outcomes lies every question the sport has to answer about what it owes the athletes who give it everything. Not after the fall, not in the press statement, but before, when there's still time. The empty space in the Coleman family photos will never be filled. The next girl is already in the gym. The question is whether the sport has finally learned to deserve her trust.